Welcome, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today and to discuss with you a so relevant topic, folliculogenesis. We will talk about folliculogenesis in general, but at the same time, I will try to discuss with you how we can spend the information provided in our clinical practice. This is my disclosure. So let's go directly straight to the point. I will discuss with you how follicular recruitment and growth occur throughout women's life. And in particular, I would like to share with you some information concerning the follicular wave theory. And I will spend some time to discuss with you how we can employ this kind of information in our ovarian stimulation, in our daily clinical practice. In a second step, I will focus on the action of gonadotropins in late stages of folliculogenesis, and in particular during final recruitment of the dominant follicle and ovulations. So let's move from the idea of follicular recruitment and growth. This is a representation of how follicular recruitment and how follicles are distributed during the long folliculogenesis phenomenon. So as you can see, it is a sort of pyramid. So we have primordial follicles in a gonadotropin independent way move to primary follicles, and in a progressive way, we have a secondary, early antral, and pre-ovulatory follicle. At any stage, we have a given percentage of follicles that don't overcome the step and goes to atresia. So we have step by step a loss in the number of follicles. So this is the nice, I can say, representation provided by Duchamp many years ago about the long process of follicle recruitment. And so you can see that at any given stage, I repeat, a given percentage of follicle is lost. And so what we have to keep in mind is that this process, from the moment follicles are at the primary stage until the moment of ovulation, we have a very long period, taking this process probably, I can say, 90 or even 120 days. So during this period, we have progressive selection. And so you can see here that follicles are, I can see, categorized in different categories or stages. What we see at scanning in our clinical practice, for instance, during a menstrual period, at the beginning of a classical stimulation in follicular phase, is the total presence of, we can say, class 5 and class 6 follicles, meaning follicles ranging between 2 and 9 millimeters. But the number of follicles with these characteristics that we have during menstruation represents, I can see the outcome of very long period of selection that started, I repeat, 1920 days before. And what we, I think, have to have as an idea that we have to keep in mind is that if we consider, for instance, the anti-Mullerian hormone. This is a concept I will come back in the next slides. The anti-Mullerian hormone is produced by follicles from the stage of primary until the stage antral follicles class 5, 6. Once follicles overcome 9-10 millimeters, they stop to produce anti-mullerian hormone. So the only stage where the follicles don't produce anti-mullerian hormone are at the stage of primordial and in the last stage of follicular selection, at the stage of preovulatory or larger antral follicles. So this is what I wanted to focus. Let's keep in mind that in a clinical practice, in ovarian stimulation, what we spend is the amount of available class 5 and class 6 follicles. So this is just to give you an information concerning clinical practice. Why do we count follicles during a menstruation for the so-called antral follicle count? Because in this pyramid, there is an equilibrium and a proportion among different stages of follicles. So in this pyramid, we can hypothesize that the more is the number of primary follicles, the more will be the number of antral class 5 follicles during our antral follicle count. So if I have, for instance, 15 antral follicles at the moment of our scanning, I can hypothesize that the basis of the triangle is very large. So the amount of primordial and primary follicles is very high, it's huge. But if at the moment of my antral follicle count, I have only 3 class 5 antral follicles, I can hypothesize that even the amount of primordial and primary residual follicles is very low. So we can have this information from another angle. This is the amount of primordial follicles. What we know is that we have a moment which is called initiation. What is initiation? It's the moment where packages or probably waves of primordial follicles move, and this is not gonotroph independent, move from this stage of primordial to the stage of primary. And from this moment, it starts the I can say, governance of gonotrophins in the following steps. So once a package, a wave of primordial follicle became primary follicles wave, from this moment in 90, 100, 120 days, these follicles will go to atresia, with the only exception of the dominant follicle. So primordial follicles can remain primordial even for 20, 30, 40 years, but once they start to go under the control of gonotrophins, they, from that moment, their destiny is, I can say, decided. So this is a schematic representation, clearly representing that from primary stage, every single step is under control of FSH androgens, and I will explain it better in the following slides. And at the end of, in the last steps of follicular growth, the rule of LH becomes even more relevant than FSH for final step of qualitative maturation of the follicle and as a consequence of the oocyte. So having this information in mind, I would like to summarize the role of anti-Mullerian hormone. The anti-Mullerian hormone, and I will discuss it later, is very important for making the, I can say, the passage from one step of folliculogenesis to the following one, to the next one, from primary to preantral, in a very, I can say, harmonic and progressive way. Because anti-Mullerian hormone is very important in the inhibition of FSH-mediated granulosa proliferation, is a modulator of follicular growth, and is a modulator of aromatase activity. So if the anti-Mullerian hormone is there, for instance, in patients with a very good ovarian reserve, the pressure of the FSH on follicles is modulated. And so any single step I described before, any single step in the Goujon scheme that I presented in the first slide will be, I can say, very synchronized and progressive. If the anti-Mullerian hormone is very low, for instance, in patients in advanced reproductive age, we have the phenomenon of asynchronicity of follicles because the progression of follicles is not so well regulated. And this is an information I will spend in the clinical practice. I will tell you how to spend in the clinical practice this kind of evidence. So this is a schematic representation of how gonotrophins move during, I can say, a menstrual cycle. You can see here FSH, and you can see that at the beginning of the menstrual cycle, during the menstruation, in the early follicular phase, there is a smooth increase in FSH because this is the moment of final steps of selection of a dominant follicle. Then when this selection is more advanced, we have a progressive decrease in the circulating FSH levels. And then we have a spike, a peak at the moment of ovulation together with the LH peak. And again, FSH will go down. So we can see that we have a sort of fluctuating FSH with a less or more pronounced peak every 15 days. So this fluctuation in FSH, I need your imagination at the moment, is obviously active on the last stage of folliculogenesis, and it is crucial for selecting dominant follicle at the end, and it's very important for also contributing to ovulation of this follicle. But let's imagine altogether the follicles as waves that moves. And I need an example. I usually prefer to give examples that can help us to have clear ideas on the process. What we have to keep in mind is that any one of these fluctuation every 15 days of FSH is only distributed at the same way on all the follicles that in waves are present at different stages. I need an example, as I said. Let's imagine all together the Roman legion. So we have the head here, and here we have the legions that advance in a very progressive and well-distributed way. So with my example, what I would like to explain is that if in a given moment, let's imagine all the section of the legions as a primordial, primary, secondary, early antral, and antral and dominant follicle. At the moment where we have, for instance, the peak of FSH at the moment of ovulation or at the beginning of the cycle, this peak is active on dominant follicles, favoring ovulation. I can say follicle rupture. But at the same time, this peak of FSH is also active on all follicles that are present in waves at different stages of maturation. So we probably not on primordial, because I stress that the first steps is not gonotrophin independent, but from primary, secondary, early antral and antral follicles, we can have at any peak of FSH and any positive fluctuation of FSH, we can imagine that there is a movement of a wave of follicles to the following step of maturation. So we have these waves of follicles at different stages of maturation moving in harmonic way. This is just an hypothesis. There are also other hypotheses, but I think that at the moment, this is the most validated. So if we consider the follicles coming back, uh, uh, but I can also use this one, we can imagine that during a menstrual cycle, from the moment of menstruation until the late luteal phase, we can imagine that we have different waves of class 5 follicles moving, reflecting the movements of waves that in harmonic and synchronous way probably moved in the weeks preceding this moment. And it has been proven that even more than two coarse waves of antral follicles can be detected during a single menstrual cycle. But there is something that we have to keep in mind, that if we consider two or three patterns of follicular waves during the menstrual cycle, we can say that some of these waves are major and some other ones can be considered minor. What is the difference? That in a major waves, we have the selection of a single dominant follicle that continues to grow, and when this follicle becomes dominant, we talk about deviation phenomenon, and this deviation can reach the real ovulation. The other follicles go to atresia. In the other waves, we don't have deviation. We have growth of follicles. No follicle reach real dominance, so there is no deviation. And at the end, that given follicular wave doesn't reach ovulation, but the wave moved anyway. So this is what usually happens. And if we put all this information together, these are the waves of antral follicles class 5 that we can detect during a single menstrual cycle. And you can see that deviation only occurs in the wave, in the major wave that can be detected only during follicular phase. Why only during follicular phase we have deviation and selection of dominant follicle? And why in the waves that we can detect in the luteal phase, 2 or 3, 1 or 2 during the luteal phase, we usually don't have deviation and ovulation? The explanation is the presence of progesterone, because during the early follicular phase, the LH pulsatility is very well regulated. The progesterone levels are very low. And when progesterone levels are very low, deviation can occur and the dominant follicle can reach maturity and until the pre-ovulatory and ovulatory stage. In the luteal phase, we have follicular waves, but these follicular waves became minor because there is no deviation, no selection of dominant ovulating follicles, because the progesterone is very high. The progesterone is able to modulate the axis, to modulate, to inhibit the LH and FSH peak. So we have selection of the follicle, but we don't have real dominance. We don't have deviation, and we cannot have LH peak for ovulation. So the follicular waves are there, but only in follicular phase we have deviation in ovulation. But by theoretical point of view, we can use exogenous gonotrophins for intercepting follicular waves at any stage of a menstrual cycle. Even giving gonotrophins here or giving gonotrophins here, we can create by exogenous gonotrophins codominance. We can create follicular growth. We can have follicular growth sustained by exogenous gonotrophins until pre-ovulatory stage in multiple follicle cohort. and we can trigger ovulation by an exogenous LH activity. Let me tell you something that I think is very important in your clinical practice. This is a nice study. We move to clinical information that has been performed by scanning, by ultrasonography, and patient had been studied in different stages in a prospective way. But what is important, patients were classified according to reproductive age. So we have a patient in mid-reproductive age between 18 and 35, late reproductive age, 36 and 44 years of age, or advanced reproductive age between 45 and 55. And so folliculogenesis had been studied by scanning at different stages during menstrual cycle. And let me tell you, there is a parameter that is very important, which is the diameter of dominant follicle of during the early luteal phase. So we are analyzing in this paper at different stages how the characteristic of follicular waves soon after ovulation. So the first luteal phase follicular wave. And so what emerged, and in my opinion is amazing, is that by aging, we have a progressive increase in the size of dominant follicles at the day, I can say 18, 20, soon after ovulation. The presence of follicular waves is different according to age. And in patients in more advanced reproductive age, we have dominant follicles earlier, soon after ovulation. In patients in a very advanced reproductive age, during early luteal phase, we can have a dominant follicles even reaching 10 or more millimeters. This is very important in our clinical practice because this is the reason why at the beginning of our stimulation in patients in advanced reproductive age, we have asynchronicity among follicles. And we have to start stimulation in a moment during menstruation where a dominant follicle is there, probably 10, 12 millimeters, and the estradiol is very high. The FSH is only apparently suppressed because the estradiol is high, but we start stimulation with the gonadotropins, and we realize that only one or two dominant follicle grow, and the smaller follicles are not recruited at the beginning of our stimulation. Let me explain better this aspect in a clinical practice. This is a case of a very young woman with a good ovarian reserve. HMH is very high in this patient. So I remind you, I said that HMH is very important in modulating the effect of FSH on follicles, in protecting follicles against too much the pressure of FSH. And the alignment of follicles here is very good. So we start with stimulation, or we can analyze here a regular spontaneous cycle. So in 7 days, in natural cycle, we have codominance of a few follicles, then we have deviation, we have dominance of a follicle, 20, 22 millimeters, we have LH and FSH peak, so we will have ovulation with on day 20 with corpus luteum. If in these young patients where the MH is very high, we perform scanning on day 12, for instance here, soon after, in the week after ovulation, we will find that all the new wave of class 5 follicles is there. We will not have a deviation because the progesterone will be high, and we will find a very good synchronicity of these follicles. So when we will analyze this patient at the beginning of the new cycle, I can say during menstruation, we will find very well aligned and synchronous follicles. Let's move to another example. Here we have a patient, for instance, 40, 42 years of age, with very low anti-Mullerian hormone. So we have ovulation, we have corpus luteum again, but during our scanning on day 20, we will find a dominant follicle of 9 millimeter that has been selected as dominant before next menstruation. And so when we will, because the anti-Mullerian hormone is very low and not able to protect against FSH, and probably in this patient, the FSH will be higher. So high FSH, low IMH, we lose synchronicity of follicles. And we have a dominant follicle during the luteal phase. So when we will perform our scanning at the beginning of the new menstruation, we will find asynchronicity. So we will find a dominant follicle and small follicles that are moving to atresia. And probably even starting stimulation with exogenous gonotrophins, it will be too late for protecting some follicles from atresia. And the effect of gonotrophin, of exogenous FSH, will be distributed on only one or two follicles. And so we have the classical discrepancy, one or two follicles going very fast in case of stimulation, and other follicles not growing. And the one classical mistake that many that is I can say occurs in the clinical practice is thinking that this patient has a very low viral reserve, so I start with a very high doses of gonotrophins. So starting in a situation like this with a very high doses of gonotrophins accelerate the growth of these follicles and probably create a window where we are not in time for rescuing this follicle from atresia. So this is something that have to be discussed if starting with high doses or with very high doses, that in my opinion makes no sense. So in coming back, let's come back to the spontaneous natural cycle. This dominant follicle during menstruation will grow faster and will probably ovulate before, between day 9 and 10. So the ovulation is anticipated. Probably the luteal phase will be shorter because usually the performance of corpus luteum is not so good in these patients. And we have the classical symptom of anticipated menstruation. One of the first signs of reduced MH and faster recruitment of dominant follicles in the luteal phase is that the length of the menstrual cycle is shortened. So 22, 24 days instead of, we can say 28, 9, 30. So that's the reason why in our community, when we started to use the antagonist cycle, we had the problem of synchronization of follicles. This is very important because if we try to modulate gonotrophins production during the luteal phase of the previous cycle, we can hope that less FSH during these stages can, I can say, make the recruitment of dominant follicles lower. And so it is something that we can spend for synchronizing follicles for the next, I can say, the follicular phase where we have to employ gonotrophins for stimulation. This is what Escher suggested. At the moment, different methods are utilized for synchronizing follicles during the previous luteal phase, progesterone or even estradiol or oral contraceptives. So in case of oral contraceptives, what is, I can say, suggested is that if we use contraceptive for synchronized follicles, When you stop contraceptive, you need to wait 5 days minimum for starting the stimulation uh, when you suspend the oral contraceptive. Um, the relevance of follicular waves has been also considered in the Poseidon classification. That is a classification system that has been proposed recently for low prognosis patients. And if we consider groups um, uh, 3 and 4, we are talking about patients with very low ovarian reserve. In particular, patients above 35 years of age are patients with very low ovarian reserve, and I can say low ovarian quality, because above 35, you know that the rate of aneuploidies in the oocytes and embryos dramatically increases. So we have a scenario where is a paradox. We have a lower ovarian reserve, restricted number of oocytes, but this is the moment where we need more oocytes because we need to overcome with the quantity the problem of quality. For instance, it has been calculated that for having at least one euploid blastocyst in patient above 40, you need between 10 and 20 oocytes because the rate of aneuploidies is very high. And so even 10, even 90% or 95% of embryos are aneuploid above 42 years of age. So you need more oocytes, but the ovarian reserve is lower. So you need more oocytes, but you cannot recruit the number of oocytes. Uh, uh, you cannot retrieve the number of oocytes you desire because the ovarian reserve is very low. So the only possibility for this patient is accumulating oocyte throughout different stimulations. And it has been proposed to employ the follicular waves. So to use a continuous stimulation or stimulation distributed in a follicular and luteal phase. So using one menstrual cycle for employing 2 follicular waves in the same menstrual cycle. So this is just to give you an explanation about how this information we have from basic science or from the study of follicular genesis can be employed in a clinical practice. This is another example, the so-called dual stim. You can see here that the stimulation is started during follicular phase with agonist triggering. We have oocyte collection after 35, 36 hours after triggering. There is a stop of 5 days, and then a second stimulation that begins 5 days after egg collection in employing the follicular wave that had been selected for the following cycle. We intercept this follicular wave during the luteal phase of the same menstrual cycle. So this is an example of how we can spend in a clinical practice. So if we have a patient with 38, 40 years of age, and this patient needs 10, 15 oocyte for hoping to have at least one euploid blastocyst, if we can not have this oocyte in a single stimulation, we can use a single ovarian menstrual cycle for reaching a number of oocytes which is closer to the one we desire, we hope to have. So I will spend a second part of my talk for moving from the general concept of follicular waves to go deeply inside what happens in a follicle that is candidated to be the dominant follicle in a given menstrual cycle. We are talking about the follicles that we spend in IVF following stimulation with exogenous gonotrophins. And I will focus the attention on the classical model of the two cells, two gonotrophins theory. So we are in this moment inside a class 5 follicle, meaning a follicle between 2 and 9 millimeters at the beginning of a new menstrual cycle. We can say, for instance, on day 2, 3 of menstruation. And so we need to understand how we can employ this follicle in our ovarian stimulation, which is the best stimulation for any given patient, for that given patient. But for understanding this, we have to move from physiology. This is the classical two-gonadotrophin two-cell theory. According to this model, we have LH that continuously acts on TICA cells. The TICA cells are here, and the TICA cells are very important for producing androgens in the right milieu, in the right balance between different categories, classes of androgens. This is what happens throughout the whole follicular phase, continuously in any follicles at any stage. This is very important because if the LH pulsatility, which is represented here, is correct, the production of androgens by TICA cells is balanced. And during the early stage of follicular phase, the production of LH is continuous. Why androgens are so important? The androgens are important because androgens induce the expression of FSH receptors in granulosa cells. This is very important. What we learned at school, that the strongest follicles, the dominant follicle, are the follicles that have the major expression of FSH receptor. But who decides how much in terms of FSH receptor a given granulosa compartment has to express? Androgens. And who decides how many androgens have to be in a given follicle? LH. So LH regulates the expression via androgens in the granulosa cells. And this action is continuous. These androgens move from granulosa to TICA cell, from TICA to granulosa cells. In granulosa cells, we have the aromatase activity, which is under the control of FSH. So these androgens are produced in TICA because of LH, move to granulosa, and in granulosa by FSH are converted in estradiol. FSH induces aromatase activity, and aromatase convert the androgens in estradiol. And so this is very important for regulating the selection of a dominant follicle, because increasing estradiol, the FSH for negative feedback will decrease. Reduced FSH the effect of reduced FSH is on the fact that only follicles expressing more FSH receptor will continue to grow in a progressive way until the selection of dominant one. I have to tell you something that is very important. In the recent years, it has been discovered that LH is also active in granulosa cells. When? Only when codominant follicles reach the stage of 9, 10 millimeters. So when follicles became codominant, overcome class 5, class 6, overcome 10 millimeters, there is the expression of LH receptors in granulosa cells. I need your attention now. Granulosa cells are not important for producing androgens. Granulosa cells are very important because they support last stages of oocyte maturation and follicular growth. So we have to consider that the same hormone, LH, plays different roles in different compartments, because in TICA cells, LH is important for inducing androgens. In granulosa cells, we don't know exactly what is the role of LH during the last days of follicle maturation. But we understood something in the last years. The first information we needed to have is that at the receptor level, the two gonadotrophin link different receptors. But in granulosa cells, the activity of these two receptors can converge in similar transduction pathways. So what I can say is that LH is very important in supporting FSH activity during last steps of follicle and oocyte maturation. The cooperation between FSH and LH increases the expression, induces the paracrine network of growth factors, which is very important in last stage of follicular genesis. And LH is also able to support aromatase activity. I have a short, very short video, which this is just for, is a list of references that you can spend, the one I used for putting this information together. This short video show you that FSH and LH in granulosa link the different receptor, but this receptor in granulosa can converge in the same transduction pathways. And in some cases, we can even have, and it has been widely proven, we can have dimerization of receptors. So we can hypothesize that if the FSH activity is very low, and this is physiological, because at the end of follicular genesis, the activity of FSH is very low, LH can support this FSH activity, and can even substitute the FSH activity. There are some clinical trials proving that in the last 3-5 days before ovulation, follicular growth can be even sustained only by exogenous LH activity without FSH. So LH is the hormone that is crucial in the last steps of follicular genesis. So coming back to our information, we can say that, coming back to the model, we can say that during the early stage of follicular growth after ovulation, after menstruation or during the menstruation, we can say that LH works in TICA for producing androgens, and FSH works in granulosa cells for converting androgens in estradiol via aromatase. But once follicle which overcome initial growth and overcome 10 millimeters, the FSH and LH converge in the same compartment in granulosa cells, and it has been widely demonstrated that this cooperation, and in particular LH, are very important for expressing anti-apoptotic activity. And I will tell you in brief why this is so relevant, but I want to tell you something that is very important in a clinical practice. I have a question at any Congress meeting I speak. The question is it useful to give LH activity during stimulation? When we should give LH? What I reply is pay attention, because if you give LH in different moments of follicular genesis, you are working in different compartments. It's not the same. Because if you provide LH since the early stage of stimulation, from day one, for instance, of our ovarian stimulation, we are pushing in TICA cells the production of androgens. So if a patient does not require this, probably we are not changing nothing. If a patient has a deficit in androgen production, the giving LH at the beginning of stimulation can increase the androgen production and can increase the expression of FSH receptors in granulosa cells. In this way, we can hypothesize that we can increase recruitment, growth of follicles, the follicle output rate, meaning the percentage of antral follicles continuing to grow during our stimulation. But if you give LH from the middle of the stimulation, you are working in another compartment. You are supporting FSH. Again, if the FSH activity is very well distributed and the patient has no problem in this, giving LH can optimize, but probably doesn't change things. But if there is deficiency in the LH activity in this granulosa compartment, giving LH in the middle of stimulation increases the support or supports better the FSH activity. And this association of FSH and LH in granulosa cells is very important for oocyte quality, not at this stage, not only for quantity. Why? Because I come back to what I wanted to say. The cooperation of FSH and LH in the granulosa compartment is very, very important for regulating apoptosis. LH is a very potent anti-apoptotic molecule. So if we go inside the follicle, you can see this is the cumulus cells compartment, the granulosa cells that are very close to the oocyte, and they are connected with the transjonal projection to the oocyte. So the more is the number of cumulus cells surviving, the more is the number of active granulosa cells, the more is the information and the molecules provided to the oocyte in the last stages of oocyte maturation. So if we hypothesize, I can say we know that LH is anti-apoptotic, LH is crucial for maintaining these granulosa cells surviving. And so we can have optimal transmission throughout transjonal projection. We can have optimal, I can say, passage of molecules and signaling, I can say, stimuli for the oocyte. This is a crucial moment because something that you probably remember is that during the last weeks, and in particular the last days before ovulation, there is an incredible increase in the volume, in the diameter of the oocyte. An oocyte that was 30 micrometers for 20, 30, 40 years, in the last weeks before ovulation, increases, fourfold increase in the diameter. But we have to remind altogether that the oocyte is a sphere. So if we have an increase, fourfold increase in the diameter, we have to consider that we have even 60-fold increase in volume. So there is an incredible increase in the volume. This increase in volume is related to the activation of transcriptional loops, I can see the storage of molecules, and everything is regulated by granulosa cells of the cumulus. So if you have more granulosa cells in the cumulus surviving, you have better cytoplasmic maturation. We only consider nuclear maturation. We say the oocyte is M2, M1, but we don't consider nuclear cytoplasmic maturation. Oocyte, one thing is genetic, the one thing is embryo competence, embryo viability. Embryo competence and viability are partially related to genetic, to the state of a euploidy, but probably genetic maturation is not the most relevant for initial stages of pregnancy. What is very relevant is cytoplasmic maturation. And cytoplasmic maturation is under the control of granulosa cells. The granulosa cells' health is under control of gonotrophins. And in the last stage, in particular, by qualitative point of view, under the control of anti-apoptotic activity of LH. That's the reason why LH is so crucial, so important in our clinical practice, because I would like to tell you that a competent and viable embryo is the effect of very good cytoplasmic maturation of the oocyte. Let's think about, for instance, in our clinical practice, let's think about what we do. We give exogenous gonotrophins, in the vast majority of cases, only FSH, in patients where agonists or antagonists of GnRH are utilized. So you can see that in case of agonists or antagonists, in the last stage of follicular growth, before triggering, we have a very well suppressed LH. So a molecule that is very crucial for the quality of the oocyte in the embryo is suppressed. If the system is able to adapt, we can say that it is not a problem, because even a small amount of LH can be sufficient for sustaining. But there are some conditions where the LH quality, endogenous LH, is lower. For instance, I like to say in patients that above 35, in patients above 38 years of age, we have less functional LH receptor. The endogenous LH is less potent by biological point of view, and the amount of the androgens in the follicles is lower. So if you imagine a patient who weighs 36, 37, or above years of age, you have low LH activity, low androgens levels in the follicle. We suppress with agonists or GnRH antagonists. We run the risk that the LH support is not so efficient. That's the reason why in my clinical practice, I suggest to integrate with LH activity in the stimulation of a patient above 35 years of age. Because an LH activity given at the beginning of the stimulation can optimize the androgens milieu and correct, I can say, recruitment for optimizing the expression of FSH receptor. And LH activity in the more advanced stage of follicular growth with exogenous gonotrophin can optimize last steps of maturation of the oocyte by qualitative point of view. Just to tell you, if we consider LH, LH is able to induce androgens and is able to express anti-apoptotic activity. If we provide LH in form of ACG, which is very common in clinical practice, the activity of ACG is very good in inducing androgens, so we can optimize androgen production and recruitment, but ACG is not able to express anti-apoptotic activity. So this is important because we have gonotrophin, we can personalize ovarian stimulation, and we have gonotrophins that we can give in a very clever way according to our aim. In this context, this is just representation of the rationale of adding some LH activity in our clinical practice, because we can hypothesize that in patient in advanced, I can say, age or reproductive age, I can see even above 35, we can have some effect from trying to correct an hypothetical physiological LH deficiency. So it's very important LH because it's synergic with FSH, it's synergic with growth factors, and increases the responsiveness of FSH and LH receptors, in particular in cases where some inhibitory polymorphisms of this receptor are present in the patient. But I would like to stress that the most important is the anti-apoptotic effect on granulosa cells. This is a trial I would like to show you. It's the only trial that, in my opinion, is very, very important. Here we have patients in a clinical practice that had been randomized to be stimulated with only FSH in form of recombinant LH, or in the second group with a combination of recombinant FSH and recombinant LH. And you can see something that, in my opinion, is very, very intriguing, that in patients below 35 years of age, the giving LH supplementation didn't change results in terms of both implantation and ongoing pregnancy rate. It's the same. But in patients between 36 and 39, you can see that both implantation and ongoing pregnancy rate were significantly improved by this addition of recombinant LH, meaning that this is a clinical proof that by aging, the LH, endogenous LH activity is lower, the androgen production is lower, so the system is less able to adapt to the use of agonists or antagonists, so the adaptation is more difficult, and providing a support by exogenous LH can correct in a given percentage of patients this deficiency. And this is the same trial. Here is just better represented. You can see that before 35 years of age, nothing changed in terms of ongoing pregnancy rate between FSH alone and FSH plus LH groups. In patients above 35 years of age, the combination of FSH and LH significantly increased or improved. You can see better here for implantation rate. The value is statistically significant. The difference is statistically significant. So this is just an example, and this is my conclusion. So what can we learn from physiology? We learn from physiology that at any age, two or more cores of waves of small antral follicles are recruited during the ovarian cycle. Synchronicity, number, size, velocity of progression of antral follicles throughout the follicular and luteal phases are modified by aging. Because in advanced reproductive age, we can have selection of a dominant follicle anticipated during the luteal phase of the previous cycle. And it is very relevant in our clinical practice because it can affect the ovarian response to the gonadotropin and administration. So we need methods, pharmacological methods, to try to make the follicular waves more synchronous and to reduce the problem of asynchronicity in the transition between last luteal phase and early new follicular phase. So synchronization of follicles is very important. In the clinical practice, DOS team is a clear example of how knowledge of physiology can represent an advantage for our clinical practice, because once we understood the phenomenon of follicular waves, we understood that we can stimulate the ovary at any given stage of menstrual cycle, having the same quality in terms of oocyte, embryos, and blastocysts, and we can employ, and it is very important in terms of time to pregnancy, for optimizing time, we can employ the same ovarian, I prefer to say, same ovarian menstrual cycle for having due stimulation and accumulating oocyte to be closer to the number of eggs we need for counteracting aneuploidies, percentages of aneuploidies in advanced maternal age. By aging, LH action is impaired. The endogenous LH is lower in terms of quality, quantity, the receptor are less performing, the androgens are lower. So probably we need more studies for definitely prove that giving LH or androgens, but I prefer to think about LH in the early stages of stimulation or even before stimulation can optimize androgen milieu and improve the FSH expression in granulosa cells and improve the early follicular recruitment during the hour of ion stimulation. And in women above 35 years, the use of LH-containing preparation may counteract the lack of androgens and probably improve ovarian response. And in the more advanced stages of maturation, LH can even optimize the survival and the health of granulosa cells, which in turn can improve the oocyte quality, meaning probably improve the embryo and blastocyst competence and viability. So this is just to talk all the colleagues working with me in the daily clinical practice, and I do thank you for your support and attention. Thank you so much.